Hi everyone, this is Tony Huang. Welcome to another episode of Chatting with GotFriends. Today we have someone very special. His name is Allan Alford. He was the former CISO or CISO for Polycom, and he's a current CISO for ForcePoint. Thank you for joining us.
Howdy, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for being on our show today. Now, you have been participating on multiple panels that we've held in the past, Allan, so thank you very much for doing so.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Let's talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing as far as the CISO, the CISO suite.
First of all, every year there's more of us. I don't think we've reached saturation yet. I think there are still companies out there that don't have a CISO, and I think that trend is ever growing. I don't know when we reach saturation point, but I can definitely tell you that there's still plenty of places that don't have one that need one. I would argue at this point any entity on the planet that does any kind of digital work at all needs a CISO.
Right. Isn't the CISO the kind of a transformation from information security up to the certain level?
Sure. There's an interesting distinction between CISO and CSO, right? CSO generally incorporating physical security as well. And you're going to see some real blurring of that distinction over the next few years because the digital-physical convergence is really a thing now. Example, my current company, we've got some interesting work happening where we are taking the physical security system from the building, right, the badge readers and the cards, and feeding that into the same analytics engine that generates, analytics for the digital stuff.
Okay.
So somebody could log into their computer and we would see that they logged in, but we could also see that they swiped in with their badge before doing so. And you can start to see where there's a blurring of that line between digital and physical. You can start to figure out, is somebody actually who they say they are? Did they really log in from the office? When we see them log into a different office, did someone steal their badge? It's starting to really converge, so it's getting very interesting in that space.
Are they reporting the same structure within inside a company, or are they? The CISO falls in the information security side, and also IT versus like CSO falls in.
Sure. Another interesting question. I think that the CSO traditionally is higher up than the CISO in terms of the reporting structure. Okay. But again, the lines are blurring, and I would argue as well that you've got in terms of CISOs themselves, you're seeing several trends. A lot of companies now, the CISO is parallel to the CIO.
Oh, okay, interesting.
But the two actually report together to the same level, probably to the CEO or the COO directly. Similarly, there are a handful of cases I've run into lately where the CIO actually reports to the CISO. The idea being that if the CISO's mission is to secure the company's assets, IT is simply one facet of how that is done.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's kind of the logic behind that move.
Okay.
I think traditionally and historically, though, most of us end up being CISOs who report to CIOs, and I don't see that as an overarching trend changing anytime soon. I think that's still the norm.
I think one of the topics that we talked about was the budgetary allocation. Do CISOs fall in different budget versus an IT director, CIO, or do they still share the same budget?
So that's an interesting question. I think it really ties into the reporting structure. Here, for example, I report to the CIO. My last CISO role was the same, but I've got my own distinct and unique CISO budget. I've got my own security concerns and things that I'm budgeted for that are certainly above and beyond the normal IT operations. But I'm paired with other IT operational folks who also have their own budgets. Okay. And that's been the trend that I've seen.
Yeah. So trends for career trends for CISOs. What's coming up next for you guys?
So that's really interesting. I think that there's an overlap with the privacy realm that we're starting to see as well. I stated earlier that most companies need a CISO and many still don't have one. Similarly, I think that a formal and organized privacy role, maybe it's a chief privacy officer, maybe it's nothing more than a DPO, a data privacy officer. Okay. Doesn't have to be all the way up to the C-suite. But I believe that a privacy role is required, and I think in a lot of cases there's even fewer of those than there are CISOs, and we're seeing that a lot of the CISOs are picking up that privacy role to some extent or another. I think every CISO is now involved in privacy, even though officially it's an information security job. I think just as there's a convergence between digital and physical security, I think there's a convergence between information security and privacy.
Okay, so let's talk. You're leading right into GDPR. Tell us about this thing called GDPR and how it's affecting most U.S. companies and also European companies.
Sure. So GDPR is a law that's been on the books for a year and a half in the EU. It's a law that affects and impacts all EU citizens. Basically, the law is designed to protect the privacy information, the personal information, I should say, of any EU citizen, wherever it might be stored or transmitted digitally. And the law goes into effect May 25th of this year. So it's been on the books for some time, but enforcement begins on May 25th. Okay. And the law basically states, to summarize it briefly, if you have any privacy information, any personal information for any EU citizen, whether it's stored in a database, stored on a file system, transmitted from a web server to a web client, wherever it might reside, that data has to be protected at rest and in transit with some industry accepted standards and norms for protection. And similarly, you've got to honor the right to be deleted. So any EU citizen could reach out to you at any point and say, hey, I don't want you to have my personal information any longer. I want to be completely expunged from your systems. Those are the two main thrusts of the law. The law is very thick. If you actually print it out and read it, there's much more to it than that. But those are the two main thrusts. Okay. It's very much about protecting personal information of EU citizens.
I think we read a part of your blog earlier this year. It's already March now. So what were your top 5 predictions? I know one of, for 2018, one of them was on a GDPR, right? So what are the other 4?
Sure. So I think GDPR is going to be pretty overwhelming, more so than people are thinking. You know, one of the first questions that everybody asks is, well, if it's an EU law, how does it apply to me here in the US, or how does it apply to me in Asia, or wherever I might be based and doing business outside of the EU? The plain fact of the matter is the legal entanglements of all these countries, the relationship between Australia and the EU, America and the EU, wherever you might be on the planet, the odds are that there's entanglement of legal structure and legal enforcement. And so I would argue that the long arm of the EU will in fact reach you wherever you might reside. So I think probably one of the biggest trends with GDPR we're going to see is when this law goes live, May 25th, when the enforcement goes live, I should say, you're going to see that a lot of companies get called to the mat. I think there's going to be some definite big company sort of showcase cases where the legislators in the EU and the regulators in the EU make examples of some of the bigger companies. So I would expect to see a big EU company, perhaps even a big American company, called to the mat, found in violation and called out and treated as examples to sort of get the rest of us in line. Right? That's the point to get across. The fines are very steep.
What are your other predictions for 2018?
So a couple of them are a little on the boring side. I know that all the hype and all the press around Internet of Things, it's no longer the popular topic. I know that the press hasn't really gotten on that like this year like they did last year, but the reality is Internet of Things is not going away. It's ever increasing. We're seeing more and more technologies that are Internet enabled. And these are technologies that aren't inherently from Internet companies or companies that are used to thinking digitally, and as a result, these are products that are inherently insecure. You're seeing all kinds of activity across the planet with insecure devices coming up, devices that can't even be patched if vulnerabilities are found, or maybe the patching infrastructure is just not really in place. It's not a mature process on the part of the company that creates. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of problems with the Internet of Things. I think there's going to continue to be a real security threat from that vector, and I think we're going to continue to see some very high-profile stories of thousands of this device and hundreds of that device and tens of thousands of this device being the source of some security woe or another.
Right. What are the other ones that you predicted?
So we talked about GDPR. Obviously, that's going to be a big one. But I think that kind of segues into a larger conversation about privacy and personal data in general, right? I think the overarching trends that we're seeing in the world are that people are more and more giving up their private data for ease of use, if you will. Look at LinkedIn and look at Facebook and look at these environments where people opt in, give away lots of private data, lots of personal data for the sake of using a free service. Even Google does this, right? Use the Google products and have your personal data tracked to a great degree with it, you know, if you're using a Google account. I think that is the trend in general. I think people are embracing less and less privacy as the world progresses, and yet there's still obviously that real personal data that we truly care about and choose to protect. And some of that data, you know, for example, medical records is very, very personal. This is the stuff that people don't want to be sharing. And yet what we saw last year and the year before and the year before that, there's been a steadily increasing trend of data breaches involving this highly personal data, especially medical data. Right. There have been, headline breaches, we don't need to go into the details, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records hijacked and stolen and downloaded and sold on the open market. Medical records being quite a tempting treat for the black market crowd. You can get somebody's credit card data for 50 cents or $1 a pop on the dark web, but medical records can go for as high as 50 or $100 each, not cents. It's a much larger distinction than medical records, and there's multiple reasons for that. Obviously, you know, blackmailing purposes. What if you could get the medical records for a political candidate, for example, would be another option. So there's a lot of value in medical records. And so the medical community continues to be, and it will grow this year even further, a really high value target, I think. I think nation state hacking is on the rise as well. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I think we're going to see.
Can you explain what that means?
So this is where active and aggressive hacking, data breaches, data theft, data loss, vandalism, destruction are taking place at the behest of a national government. This is nation state hacking. There have been many high-profile cases, again, in the last couple of years, some proven, some not. But there was a substantial raid on a bank in India, and quite a lot of money was hijacked. It was believed that the North Korean government was actually behind that. I've got friends in the video game industry, and they've told me that nation-state hacking is actually behind a lot of the video game hacks that happen. If you look at the online games, there's online currency that gets traded, you know, virtual money for in-game purposes. There are ways to exchange real money for that virtual money out there in the world. A lot of the game companies don't encourage it. In fact, it's against their terms of service, but this market of virtual currency exists. And what will happen is nation-state hackers will raid these games and try to take over, manipulate the databases, generate a huge amount of virtual currency, and then export that out and trade that for real money in the real world. So the nation-state hacking is everywhere. It's happening against banks. It's happening against the video gaming industry. It's happening nation-state to nation-state. Pretty much every nation of any size, shape, and form has a defensive cyber unit, and most of them won't admit it, but they have an offensive cyber unit as well. Look at Stuxnet as another example of that kind of activity. So I think we're going to see an increase in nation-state hacking. I think that's definitely coming. I think we will see more as the year progresses. There will be some high-profile cases, as there were last year and the year before, and I don't expect to see a decrease there. I expect to see an increase.
So, Allan, what else are on top of your mind for the prediction of 2018?
So I think workforce cyber defense is probably one of the biggest issues that isn't necessarily being treated as its own discrete issue today, and I think it needs to be. We spoke about GDPR and the intersection of employees and customers and vendors and their private data with your networks and systems as a corporate entity. We spoke about global privacy and personal data and what a tempting target it was. And we spoke about nation-state hacking, right? Add all these together, and what you're talking about is a very interesting intersection. In the workforce, you have your own data and your own assets, right? In the corporate environment, you have your own data, your own assets that you want to protect. You have an employee base that you want to protect. You have an employee base who might also be suspect, and we'll talk about that in a second. But fundamentally, all these things converge, right? You've got privacy information, both your corporate private information and your employees' private information. You've got nation-state hacking and other types of hacks that are coming after this data. That privacy data is a high-value target, right? Private and personal information is a high target. So you have to craft a solution that addresses all of these concerns and all of these vectors simultaneously. You have to be able to protect your assets while protecting your people and your employees as well. And you have to also consider that your employees might be what you need protection from. So there's three examples I'll give you. Let's say that one is a genuine and legitimate employee who is a good worker and follows all the rules and does all the right things, and his or her account gets hijacked and his or her credentials get stolen, right? So now you have activity taking place on your network under the aegis of a single employee, and you have to be able to figure out very quickly, is this legitimate activity or not? Is it really this person? And is the activity they're doing something this person should be trying to do and should be able to do? Another example would be a malicious insider, somebody who actually is, let's say, a nation-state plant. You think that you've hired a new engineer and you've actually hired a spy. This would be an outright and malicious attempt on the part of a user to access your resources. And again, operating under the aegis of a certain identity, moving about and doing things. So the other possible option is an employee going rogue, a malicious insider who has, for whatever reason, you give someone their termination notice and they decide to try to hack the company and steal what they can before they leave, or you know, bitter ex-employee still has account access somehow. These scenarios exist as well. So how do you protect in all three of these scenarios, right? We talked earlier about the zero perimeter world, the idea that we've sort of lost control of where the data might reside. We've talked about BYOD, another example of where you don't control where the data resides. And so you add all of this together, and traditional tools leave you utterly helpless and frustrated. There's not a CISO on the planet can tell you with full assurance, without all the right tools in place, and we're not talking traditional tools here either, there's no CISO that can assure you, I know where all of my data is, and I control the state that that data is in. I can tell you who has access to it and who does not. You can't do this anymore. So it's imperative that you look at the human beings as one vector and the data itself as another vector, rather than try to wrangle with the perimeter any further, rather than worrying about the device that was brought in BYOD. It's all about the intersection of people and data, and I think that's where the new trends are coming. I think that's where the new exciting technologies are going to be, and I think that human data intersection is really the key area to focus on for this year. This is also about an employer's obligations to protect the employees themselves, right? Right. As an employer, you hold privacy and personal information of your employees, and it's not just GDPR saying through regulation you have to protect it. There's an obligation to protect the data that you have. And so this may not just be legal, this may just be an ethical obligation, but nonetheless that obligation exists. And the same tools we use to identify the malicious insider, to identify the outside hacker trying to come in, to identify the innocent user whose credentials have been hijacked, those same technologies have to be brought to bear to protect not just the corporate information that needs to be protected, the corporate data, but also the employees' data. Right. So ultimately, you're talking about a convergence of technology and policy here to ultimately forge a way of protecting the corporation, of protecting the employees, of identifying good actors and bad actors, whether they're inside or out, and ultimately of protecting that data no matter where it resides and no matter where it goes. With the zero perimeter and the BYOD, it all comes back together to that human data intersection.
So, final wrap up here, Allan. If someone's a brand new CISO, what is she or he should be looking out to do?
Start with the basics. Start with the basics. Make sure that you have sound policy and a sound security framework to drive what you do. Make sure that you have a sound operating model that adheres to that framework. Start with the basics, start with the classics. It's time to innovate. Like we talked about, zero perimeter is here. BYOD is here. Simply having a strong framework and a strong foundation isn't sufficient. It's important to understand that intersection of security and privacy. It's important to understand that as you're protecting yourself, you must also protect your employees. And it's important to understand that data and people are the most important in the equation, far less than the mechanisms or the functions, right? Yeah. And that would be my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, thank you, Allan, for joining us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, hope you learned something new and impactful today. Again, this is Tony Huang. Thank you for joining us on Chatting with GotFriends. See you next time.
Thank you, Tony.